It's classified beyond the normal briefing for the president. The president of the United States and the director of the CIA were being denied access. We actually are living in a situation where the extreme secrecy Eisenhower warned us about, the worst of that has come to fruition. And frankly, no one is reporting that, certainly not the mainstream news media. There are sociopaths who are in super secret projects that don't want us to have it. I'm working now to try to bring this information, and more equally importantly, the technologies that are behind these spacecraft and things that are being reported on CNN now, because what the public isn't being told is that we have in fact figured out how those objects operate, and that would give us an entirely new and advanced civilization where we would not need fossil fuels, oil or gas or coal or nuclear power. So it's a very big story. Most people think the secrecy around this is because the government has just been incompetent. That's not true. That narrative is a false narrative. The true narrative is that I will quote from a top secret memo released during the past few decades, but it was dated 1951, and it stated that the subject was the most classified matter in the US government, exceeding the classification of the development of the hydrogen bomb. I'm quoting. So a lot of people think this is about aliens. I said, no, it's not about ETs. It's about humans, and how are humans going to get out of the conundrum we're in, which is a very serious problem, and move forward as a civilization instead of sliding backwards. The public thinks that, God is in heaven and everything is in orbit and everything is, we actually are living in a situation where the extreme secrecy Eisenhower warned us about, the worst of that has come to fruition. And frankly, no one is reporting that, certainly not the mainstream news media. This is not just the United States, by the way. The same situation exists in Great Britain, Australia. I've met with ministers of defense in most of the Five Eyes countries, which are, of course, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Great Britain, US. I think this is the part of the story that people have a hard time, in a sense, getting their minds around, because we all grew up with our history lessons and our civics lessons, and the president is the commander in chief and blah, blah, blah. In reality, the emperor has no clothes, and there are classified projects that go on, unfortunately, that are not supervised by the president or the Congress. And actually, the CIA director's wife, who at the time was the chief operating officer of the National Academy of Sciences, said to me during our 2 or 3 hour meeting with the CIA director, she turned to me, she said, how are these civilizations communicating across the vastness of interstellar space? Because the speed of light is too slow. And for people who aren't scientists on your viewership, let me explain. At the speed of light, to go 1% of the way across our own galaxy, the Milky Way, would take, which is 1,000 light years, which is the distance light goes at 186,000 miles every second for a year. That's 1 light year. 1,000 light years is 1% of the way across our galaxy, which is 1 galaxy amongst trillions. But at the speed of light, for you to even communicate and say, hey, how are you doing? And to answer back, that would be the time since the birth of Christ, 2,000 years, for that transmission to happen with what you and I are using right now on electromagnetic signals. So we knew as scientists, and that there had to be something else that these civilizations were using. And what we discovered was that they have very sophisticated electronics. And this is, of course, what Elon Musk at Neuralink, he has a company called Neuralink, is working on, that interface with directed thought. Now, this is probably where I've lost half your audience. And they're going, what? What we had discovered is that, in fact, these civilizations that are from various star systems have technologies that Elon Musk could only dream about. In other words, they very accurately transmit and send and receive directed quanta of thought instead of an electromagnetic signal per se, through what's called field consciousness. And the consciousness field is, it sounds very Buddhist or Vedic, but the consciousness field is actually not bound by space or time. And because of that, there's no limit on the speed of it. It's instantaneous because of what's called non-locality in physics. Is a bit obtuse and technical to get into probably here, but what non-locality means is that it's not based in the linear speed of light or the linear speed of sound or what have you. It's instantaneous because of the nature of conscious field, the field of consciousness. This is, to me, the most interesting stuff, because this whole science of consciousness is actually the big science for the next 1,000 years, but we have to catch up to the last 70 to 100 years of energy and propulsion technologies that have been hidden away so we don't destroy the biosphere. Why are we still using jet engines from the 30s, 40s, 50s, or rockets from the 40s? I'm saying because the alternative would completely terminate the petrodollar system and oil and gas and coal and nuclear power and public utilities. All of it is redundant, completely unnecessary. Tesla actually had a prototype car that was pulling energy out of the environment. And he didn't really understand what that was. We do now. It's called zero-point energy or quantum vacuum energy. But basically, just for people who are non-scientific, if you visualize a coffee cup, the amount of space inside that cup has enough energy to boil off all the oceans of the planet in its potential. And it's called the zero-point energy field. It's been quantified. It was in academic papers in the 50s, so-called Professor Casimir effect. But Tesla stumbled across this way back, early 20s, I believe, maybe before. But JP Morgan said, look, if we can't put a meter on it, we don't want it. So Tesla died a very bitter man. I always joke that Elon Musk doesn't have a Tesla that he's manufacturing. He has a Musk. And the reason I say that sort of jokingly is that a true Tesla would never have to be plugged into the grid. It would be pulling energy out of this state of energy that's around us through very high voltage systems. They're called VHV, very high voltage systems that create an opening into that energy field. And Tesla did enough experimentation with these sort of very high voltage systems at certain resonant frequencies, cycles per second, hertz, that he broke into that area of science, but no one wanted it to come out. Now, fast forward 100 years later, we're still burning gasoline in engines and rocket fuel and jets. And that's a tragedy for the human race, but it's a tragedy for the planet, and it's a tragedy for our children and my 9 grandchildren. So my concern is, the future. The past is the past, but we have to figure out how to catch up sort of back to the future. It's like that cartoon show, The Jetsons, when they showed people flying around in these cars. When that cartoon was made, those technologies were already developed. They're not going to say, A, we know what these are, B, we know where they come from, C, we figured out how they work. Let me give you a date that's going to probably curl your toes. October 1954. That was the date we mastered gravity control. Now, what do I mean by gravity control? What I mean by gravity control are high voltage systems that cause an object to what looks like levitate or move the way that vehicle that you saw in that video released by the Pentagon this week. And they confirmed, yes, this is real footage. And they released 3 different videos. What they didn't say, because the people releasing it don't know this, because of the compartmentalization, is that there is an unacknowledged compartmented program that began studying this in the 40s and 50s, and by 1954 had figured out how those things operate.
It's quite provable now that we do know that some of these objects are extraterrestrial and some are made by us that people are seeing.
We have things flying over our military bases and places where we're conducting military exercises, and we don't know what it is, and it isn't ours. So that's the legitimate question to ask. I would say that, frankly, that if it's something of outside this planet, that might actually be better than the fact that we've seen some technological leap on behalf of the Chinese, the Russians, or some other adversary.
We have been experimenting with these technologies since the 40s and 50s, but had mastered the basic science for lift and movement in strange ways without a rocket or a jet engine in the 50s. So a lot of people are being deceived on this, quite deliberately, because I think the bigger secret than the fact that we're not alone in the universe is that we have highly classified projects that have technologies that would make your hair curl, that are so advanced.
But the bottom line is, if there are things flying over your military bases and you don't know what they are because they're not yours, and they exhibit potentially technologies that you don't have at your own disposal, that to me is a national security risk and one that we should be looking into.
And the reason that's kept secret is that if that information comes out and is acknowledged, then the next step is every scientist in the world, and technology company in the world is going to say, how are they operating? And when they ask that question, it'll be answered. We have the answers. And it's the end of oil, gas, coal, public utilities, internal combustion engines, jets, rockets, all of it's obsolete. So you're talking more than $1,000 trillion in assets, commodities, financial instruments that would be made worthless. So the secrecy has to do with geopolitical power and control and financial control and power and corruption. So when you see a story like that in the New York Times, you have to understand what the context is. There are people who are being allowed to say a certain amount of information. If they say something too far, then they're going to try to retract it because there were so many people saying, what? We have a technology project studying these things? For how long? Well, that is a question they do not want asked by the media, by the public, by Congress, by the president, because that means that what's going to come out is the biggest scandal. It will make Watergate look like nothing. And that is that there is a very classified project that's been around since the 40s and 50s that we haven't even needed rockets since the mid-50s. So that information is so scandalous that that's a bridge too far, and that's why it gets pulled back every time it begins to emerge. And for example, my archive is filled with documents, footage, and top secret people who have dealt with this stuff. But that won't get reported in the mainstream media because the big media is actually answering to the CIA on this. And we can prove this. Project Mockingbird is constitutional attorney Daniel Sheen has stated, back in the 70s when he was doing the Pentagon Papers, Mr. Sheehan said he saw a document that listed 42 senior editors, mainly national security editors, at all the world's media that were on the payroll of the CIA to change and kill stories. So this is why the public is never, writ large, going to get the truth on this subject through the mainstream media.
The U.S. Navy has finally acknowledged that videos appearing to show UFOs flying through the air are real. They don't call them UFOs, they call them unidentified aerial phenomena.
The UFO reports were first investigated by a secret $22 million program, part of the Defense Department budget, that investigated reports of UFOs.
If you are read in, you're given this classified information, you are expected to maintain secrecy. You're expected to go along with whatever the cover story is for those special access programs. And if you don't go along with the cover story, then you can be prosecuted. So you, for example, you have to deny, if you're working for the Air Force or you're a congressman, if someone asks you about a particular program that you know about that involves some of these reverse engineered craft that are being built at Plant 42, you've got to deny its existence. And you've got to go along with whatever the cover story is, otherwise you can be prosecuted. So this has been a very effective system that's been developed over decades.
Recently, a NASA scientist has debunked recent footage from the ISS, claiming it to be obsolete instrumental equipment to be sent down to Earth to burn in its atmosphere. Notice, as this object leaves Earth, it fires a plasmic green thrust. This is obvious evidence of the International Space Station being visited by something from another world or something from a dark project. If an advanced civilization could travel from galaxy to galaxy, they would be traveling much faster than the speed of light, entering different dimensions. Could these beings be time travelers jumping from dimension to another, showing itself by the International Space Station? December 8, 2018, a mysterious craft approaches the Cargo X space station as it rendezvous with the International Space Station.